Good afternoon to our registered participants, viewers online through the live stream and also YouTubing at a later stage. Welcome everyone to this seminar on European strategic autonomy, from words to action, ? It's a webinar eventually, which is being organized instead of an in-person event, courtesy of the rebellious workers striking in Belgium today, which meant that several of our speakers could not fly into Brussels to attend in person. We apologize for the rather late conversion to this online format, but we're happy nonetheless to have the full crew with us for this event, which has been organized in cooperation with the Finnish Institute for International Affairs, FIA, represented here by Niklas Helvig, who is a leading research fellow there, and also Katarina Mustasita, also leading research fellow at FIA in Helsinki, to mark the publication of a special issue of the European Foreign Affairs Review in April, devoted exactly to European strategic autonomy. And the journal has, with its publisher, kindly opened access of all the contributions to this special issue until the end of June. We will be posting the web link to the Kluwer website for free downloads in the chat function of this Zoom call. So welcome everyone, and I should of course mention also Tanja Latizi, a policy officer nowadays at the European External Action Service. Welcome, and Tobias Gerke, research fellow at the Egmont Institute, sister think tank of SEPS here in Brussels. So welcome to you all. Well, strategic autonomy has, of course, been a phrase that has been knocking about for years now in the Brussels bubble under different iterations. It has often been used in almost the same breath with another concept, European sovereignty, perhaps a dubious concept to be used for a European Union and its integration process, which has been traditionally devoid of establishing sovereignty as a state or a super state of its own. But exactly to make sense of both evolution, the debate, the ambiguities around these concepts, we would like to first hear from Niklas Helvig what the research has found in this respect, before we then touch upon the impact that both the debate has had on the positioning of the European Union in an increasingly complex, geopolitically contested environment, of course, which only recently received its most devastating blow with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we'll certainly touch upon those issues and both the policy and action responses by the European Union and its member states institutions in due regard. But Niklas, why don't you frame for us first the conceptual thinking around the evolution of the concept?
Yes, thank you so much, Stephen, for this introduction, and thank you also to CEPS for co-organizing this webinar now with us, also on behalf of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. We are very sorry that we can't be with you today. This was definitely planned in another way, and I feel after this pandemic, it would have been nice to do this in person. We started this research project, if I can say a couple of words on that, already back in early 2020. And Tobias Gerke, who's going to speak later, has been part of this research, for example, from the start, but so have many of my colleagues here at FIA, but also colleagues from the US, from Russia, and from other places in Europe, from Germany, for example, and from France. And well, we had to do everything online so far. So I was very much looking forward to an in-person exchange, but this will have to wait for another time. But yeah, so as one result of this research project, we had a research report at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs that came out in May 2020. So you can still check this out on our website. But now, as Stephen said, we have this special issue of European Foreign Affairs Review online. And let me, as Stephen said, tell you something a little bit about how we thought about this conceptually. So I'm going to make 2 points in this very short introduction. First, how do we understand European strategic autonomy? What are the drivers? What are the issues of analysis that we look at? And then the second point is, now that we see this massive change, external shock with the invasion of Ukraine, how does that maybe change our understanding? And what is left of the strategic autonomy debate? So I want to say two words about that as well. So as Stephen mentioned already, this is, of course, a very hot term, strategic autonomy. It has been all over the policy documents in Brussels in recent years, and I don't need to go through them because I think many in the audience know about the EU global strategy, about the trade review and other issues, and we're going to talk about more of these issues probably later as well. And this research that we did was not about buying necessarily into this narrative, but first of all, appreciating or noticing that this narrative is there, and then critically examine what this discourse is about, why it came about, and what kind of implications it has. And what does it tell us about the EU as a global actor or as a security actor going forward? So there you will find different angles in this special issue, from trade, from economic relations, from relationships to different countries like the US and like to China. So, and this strategic autonomy concept is, of course, quite old. It goes back to the 1990s. Back then, it was focused on military capabilities, especially in the area of crisis management, and what the EU can do there. It was focused very much on the US as the significant other, and the question, what happens after the end of the Cold War? Will the US stay committed to European security? But the starting point from our analysis was that this was a debate 30 years ago, and today we are in a completely different debate with different drivers that push this strategic autonomy discourse. And we identify the three drivers. One is the often talked about great power competition between the US and China that undermines to some extent the rule-based order and risks to put the EU in a very difficult place because it doesn't really do great power competition and is very reliant on the rules-based global order, or however you want to define it. The second driver is the technological disruption and the digital, especially the digital revolution that we are witnessing, and which forces the EU and its member states to play catch up and to find its place in this technological race. And the third driver is the emergence of the weaponization of the global economy, so that we see more and more international actors, also, by the way, the European Union, using economic power to leverage to advance its security interests or its normative position globally. And these three trends underline the EU's need to manage its interdependence with others in the world. So our understanding of strategic autonomy is not about breaking off ties completely, decoupling and drawing up the drawbridges like it's sometimes interpreted in the debates. But it is more about, okay, we have these interdependencies, but we realize these interdependencies come with certain risks, so they need to be managed. These interdependencies are there when we talk about military alliances. These they are present when we talk about especially also economic interdependencies. Now, the second point briefly that I wanted to make is where does the war in Ukraine leave us with now? I often hear the argument that with the invasion of Ukraine, the idea of European strategic autonomy is dead. It underlines completely the fact that when it comes to military security and defense, we are completely dependent on the United States. So when you take a very narrow interpretation and a reading of the strategic autonomy discourse, there is definitely a case to make here. For example, when it comes to European defense industries, that was one area where there was a lot of talk in recent years about strategic autonomy in terms of defense industries and defense technology. So how can the European Defense Fund, for example, or PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, how can that support the European defense and industrial base? And there, of course, we see now that for many member states, take Germany, for example, speed is of essence here, and they rather buy off-the-shelf military technology for that Zeitenwende than investing into long-term European projects. We saw that with the F-35 as a very symbolic thing with the F-35 fighter jet purchase announcement of Germany recently. So certainly there are arguments in the defense area where you can say, okay, there is a challenge for this idea of strategic autonomy. However, as I said earlier, we adopted this broad idea of strategic autonomy. And here I would argue that this notion is more important than ever, actually. And we're going to see in the coming years probably even more focus on strategic autonomy. And I don't want to be tied down now to the term strategic autonomy. It might come under European sovereignty, as well as Stephen mentioned, or under some other type of terminology. But this idea of European ability, European assertiveness to some extent will definitely grow. For one, because the invasion of Ukraine will likely accelerate this dynamic of great power competition between the US on the one hand and China and to some extent maybe in relationship with Russia on the other side. So this narrative of democracy versus authoritarianism raises the question, where is the EU, where's the European Union and its member states in this great power game, where it is going to position itself there. We see also the weaponization of economic relationships now with, again, after the war, or in relation with the war in Ukraine, the case of Russia and energy relations. Energy exports to Europe are quite striking, of course. I don't need to go into detail there, but the question of how the EU can protect itself against economic coercion will be something also in the future to look at. So I think strategic autonomy discourse is very alive and kicking and needs further analysis. And on this economic side, we're going to hear Tobias also later. And then there are domestic risks in terms of the United States that we have to look at in the future as well. And of course, the 2024 elections are looming large. And the question is where the EU, to what extent the EU can acquire its military capabilities, military, also strategic culture maybe, so that it is able to provide more for its own security. So this idea that that now that the war returned to Europe, that strategic autonomy idea would be buried, I would contest that, and I see rather that these long-term trends that we find in our special issue are actually underlined, and we will see further discussions on that. But I leave it at that now.
Thanks very much, Niklas, for setting the scene and offering indeed some ideas, some criticism also that have been hurled at the European Union, and the debate about strategic autonomy as the world divides, it seems, between two camps led by the G2. We will first, before entering in some of these debates, divide the rest of our presentations into two blocks, I assume, the security and defense conflict prevention part, and then the more geoeconomic trade part, as you mentioned, turning to open strategic autonomy. So Tanya, also cognizant of time and the fact that you will have to leave at 10 to 2, why don't you lead us a little bit into the conversation held at the European External Action Service, in particular following the publication of the Strategic Compass.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you for giving me my cue to speak about the Compass. I think it's excellent timing, actually, to speak about the Compass. It's almost the 3-month anniversary of the Compass. It would have been even better if your event would have been tomorrow to have a perfect symmetry, but okay, we work with what we have. So I have the Compass right here. This baby came out on the 21st of March, was adopted. And this is what I will focus on today. I'll make 3 brief points. First, I'd like to contextualize a bit the Compass into the whole strategic autonomy debate. Then I would like to ask, why does it matter? And then where do we go from here? So these are the 3 points. So what does the Compass make of strategic autonomy per se? Well, what I found interesting as when I joined the External Action Service, as you mentioned, Stephen, was, and when we started working on the Compass, when I joined, together with member states and with the EAS and other institutions, was to see in the discussion this shift from the EU's modus operandi in foreign policy, in the sense of arguing over concepts, how we name things, how we frame things, to discussing concrete ideas for action. So this shift was very, very noticeable, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And here I want to emphasize that it's important to always mention who exactly invaded Ukraine, not to leave Ukraine as framed as the victim. It was Russia who invaded Ukraine. I think it's important to mention that when we refer to this. But for example, in the debate itself, before the invasion as such, we were debating how to find, for example, the best balance and formula to describe the implication of Russia's actions elsewhere, everywhere, really, in the Compass. After the invasion, it became very clear to everyone that Russia and Russian actions represent a long-term and direct threat for European security. And this is a direct quote from the Compass. And it became clear to everyone it was a non-debate almost. And as for strategic autonomy per se, I think the Compass doesn't go into the intellectual debate of what the concept as such means. Member states decided to leave this to the European Affairs Review Journal. But instead, it was quite interesting to see that member states ultimately have adopted a strategic document which is intended to, quote, enhance the EU's strategic autonomy and its ability to work with partners, end of quote. So the Compass as such is de facto seen as a way to consolidate this strategic autonomy. So the concept itself was not part of the debate as such, but rather taken in. Now, moving on to my second point. Everything that I've said, I think, begs the question, why does the Compass matter? Or as cynics love to ask me and my colleagues, how do we know this is going to be different from anything the EU has done so far? This is what I hear most often, right? Well, I can already tell you that it's already very different from everything else we have done so far. One has to also remember that the EU is still a young player when it comes to security and defense, operating within quite strict boundaries when it comes to treaty language and so on. And with the Compass, we have attempted to increase this level of ambition, in particular by learning from past mistakes, taking what works and changing what doesn't work or what hasn't worked in the past. And I think there are 4 concrete aspects which merit attention that make the Compass very different from anything we've done so far. The first is that the Compass is not shy. The Compass really calls it as it is, and the most clear example here is on Russia. The second is that the Compass is actionable. It gives us a really rich and concrete to-do list to reach the strategic objectives that we discussed. And this list actually contains concrete actions in almost each of the areas that were just outlined by Niklas, actually. The third aspect is that the compass gives us a precise calendar. Each of these concrete actions come with clear deadlines by which they need to be completed. And most importantly, the fourth aspect is that the compass is politically owned. And this is the most politically owned document of its kind. And this is really the most important aspect. It is the first time that 27 defense ministers, 27 foreign ministers jointly adopted this document, and then 27 heads of state and government endorsed it. So this is why it matters, right? It gives us a concrete, a politically owned roadmap and calendar to reach the ambitious objectives that we discuss in the context of EU defense. Now, final point, where do we go from here, right? Especially after Russia's invasion and continued aggression in Ukraine. Well, on our side, you asked me about the External Action Service. The focus, in my job at least, is on full speed implementation of the compass. This is the focus right now. And I can already tell you that we are very much on track for this year. Just for 2022, we have 51 actions that need to be implemented. So our plate is full, but it's going on really well, and so far at least. And I'd like to say that, if the compass is implemented fully with if we tick every box, everything next to the to-do list, this will be a turning point in EU defense. And this will also make the EU a stronger partner for our friends and allies. And this will also, of course, send different signals to our enemies too. So how has Russia's invasion of Ukraine affected EU defense and the implementation of the compass? Well, in short, very profoundly, too profound to be able to outline this in 7 minutes. But I can say that there's a very palpable shift in mentality, in perspective, and the possibilities that there are, and what EU defense can actually achieve. And I can give some concrete examples. There's plenty, but I can give three. Out of symmetry, I have 3 points. 3 months anniversary, to have some symmetry in life now with all the disruption caused by Brussels. So these 3 examples that I'll give, I think, are very well known, but I think it's important to bring them into the broader strategic discussion on EU defense, and because I think each of these have long-term strategic implications. The first one is the milestone of the European Peace Facility. I think you're all familiar with it. It's been in the news a lot, and rightfully so. And to date, the EU has allocated 2 billion to fund military assistance. This is the first time the EU has done this. Not to note also that 90% of this is lethal assistance. Again, an absolute first for the EU, especially when it comes to agreeing in record time, like 24 hours, as it was for the first batch. Second example, it may seem like ages ago, but it's important to remember that actually at the beginning of the war, when the Americans and when NATO chose to have a much more cautious approach, it was the EU which immediately came to the forefront, rose up to the occasion, immediately mobilized its structures, its convening power to jump up and bring some coordination into the chaos of an ad hocness, if that's a word, of the military assistance that was being provided to Ukraine. And equally to ensure that we are actually giving to Ukraine what Ukraine needs. Yeah, so this was a key role that the EU military staff fulfilled. And it often goes a bit under the radar, but it's important to keep this in mind. And it was the EU military staff that ensured coordination with the US, with NATO, with Australia, New Zealand, Korea, etc. It was the EU, yeah? And this is not nothing. Final example, if we look at national developments, which I think bring represent strategic shifts and have long-term implications, you mentioned the German site in defense. I won't go into that. We saw the Danish vote to opt in to security and defense. You may have seen it on Twitter today. It was just signed formally that as of July, the Danes are in. We see Ireland holding a national debate on their military neutrality. Of course, we see Finland and Sweden wanting to deepen their security alliances. When these strategic shifts, each of these contribute to this new vision of EU security and defense. Let's also remember, in the same context, the Versailles summit in March, when it was EU leaders coming to the EU institutions and asking us, come up with common solutions to boost our defense. Not the other way around, us telling them, look, guys, that we have a lot of deficiencies, fragmentation, we need to do this and that. No, it was the other way around. And what came out of that, the ideas that emerged, such as on joint procurement, for example, the defense nerds on this call will know This was a total taboo a couple of months ago only. So there are strategic shifts that we are witnessing. And to conclude, because I don't want to be too long, I think whether we factor these different aspects into the broader EU strategic autonomy intellectual framework or not, whether we call it strategic autonomy or not, whether we call it strategic culture was mentioned or strategic sovereignty, it is clear to me from all of that it is exactly in this intense and very unpredictable geopolitical situation where one needs a compass that is strategic and where one needs a compass that can help bring this strategy into the whole debate of how the EU can achieve more autonomy and decrease dependence. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Maybe a follow-up question already now, knowing that you will have to leave us a bit earlier. Strategic autonomy has been framed, maybe even defined by the European Union as a capacity to act autonomously when and where necessary, and with partners wherever possible. But in the area of defense, isn't it fair to say that the EU just depends on partners only at this stage? It cannot do, and this was a point touched upon also by Niklas, it can't do without the centrality of its relationship to NATO to keep up its own pants, so to speak, in military terms.
No, it's a question that is on everyone's minds, but I wouldn't see it necessarily from that frame. And this is also what I meant when I said that if the compass is implemented fully, this will leave the EU or the EU's partners even better off, because it will make the EU as such a better partner. In the compass, you may have seen, you can easily Control F NATO and see how many times our partnership with NATO is mentioned. And of course, some may interpret this as a sign of our dependency, because why not? But I would rather focus on the importance of deepening this relationship, which has become so much more obvious now in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine, where the EU, I believe, has precisely shown that it can be it can act in full complementarity with NATO. It has used all the instruments that it has at its disposal to complement the military defense and deterrence proper that is core to NATO's mission. So I think this only symbolizes that, or makes an even stronger case for stronger future EU-NATO cooperation. We'll see what comes out of the NATO summit. There's for the first time a transatlantic dinner where EU leaders are going to be invited, Finland and Sweden equally, where this is going to be discussed. We'll have another declaration that will hopefully cement this cooperation. And as regards the US, I think the EU's recent actions in defense, and even more so now the speed and robustness with which it has reacted during the war, has demonstrated to our American friends that the EU is and can be a defense actor in its own right. And I think the proof of this is that finally, after many years of negotiations, we have managed to set up an EU-US security and defense dialogue. And this is very symbolic in itself. You may say, yeah, okay, this is what the EU does, dialogues with everyone. Not on security and defense, not with America. Before, every time the EU wanted to discuss defense with the US, we were relegated to NATO. Defense is for NATO. With you guys, we discuss trade, we discuss the economy, we discuss digital issues. Not anymore. Since, well, I think it was December last year when this was inaugurated. This year, already an iteration of the dialogue happened. And in itself, this is a recognition by the Americans that the EU can actually be a defense player outright, and that it is actually in their interest that the EU is a defense player in its own right, and that it works together with NATO. Because let's not forget, if we look at the American latest national defense strategy, which was, by the way, elaborated after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they state very clearly that Russia is an increased threat to the European continent and to the peace on the continent, but that China remains the main and principal long-term strategic threat to US security. And this tells us something. And this also brings another level of explanation of why this administration, at least, has been extremely supportive of EU-NATO cooperation and of EU-US security and defense cooperation. So I wouldn't say, I wouldn't focus solely on the lens of dependency, but I would focus on the lens of what the EU can bring through its unique toolbox of instruments. We love our toolboxes in the EU. I would focus on that rather than the rather limited dependency lens, and then look at what we can do and what is happening now, really milestones, I would say, on changing that. As I just mentioned, joint procurement. The Commission is really busy right now together with the EAS, with the EDA, to do precisely that, to take similar steps that we have taken during COVID crisis to boost our defense and even integration in this field. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. If we have time still after the next two presentations, we might come back to you if you're still there, or otherwise indeed to our Finnish colleagues on the question of increasingly overlapping memberships between the EU and NATO, with Finland and Sweden, of course, poised to join NATO, and what value added there might, after all, still be for the European Union in defense. You gave us a few clues already, Tanya. Thanks for that. But I'm keen to move on to Katarina, who takes a slightly different perspective on the security lens, of course, by focusing on EU conflict prevention. And the question is, of course, as your main title of the contribution to the European Foreign Affairs Review special issue goes, preventing what for whom, Katarina?
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you especially for our SEPS colleagues for such a short notice and smooth change into a web format. It would have been, of course, really nice to be there and jointly discuss, but now we will do with this. So indeed, in my chapter to the FR special issue, I explored the topic of strategic autonomy from this rather a topic or approach that has received relatively less attention thus far, which is indeed the implication of this narrative on strategic autonomy for the EU's positioning as a civilian conflict preventer. And by conflict prevention, I refer to both structural and operational measures that aim at sustainably lowering conflict parties' rationale for future armed mobilization. So in concrete terms, these efforts are the efforts that, as Tanya was mentioning in the strategic compass, NATO is mentioned many times. I actually just checked, and there are 30 times NATO is mentioned. Conflict prevention, on the other hand, is mentioned 6 times. So conflict prevention is kind of very closely related role for the EU, but within conflict prevention, we more emphasize and talk about measures such as support to local peace building and national peace building architectures, EU's instruments such as the Global Europe and ICSP within it, mediation support, addressing root causes of conflict such as inequalities. And now what I found interesting when we think about this strategic autonomy discussion is that if and when we indeed define strategic autonomy as this ability to maintain and manage interdependencies, an ability to take self-determined policy decisions and kind of action, this field of civilian conflict prevention is actually something that the EU, in relation to, for instance, what Tanya was just talking about, defense and kind of hard security, civilian conflict prevention is a field where the EU actually has potential to be autonomous. And this is really because conflict prevention, and particularly now again understood as the civilian conflict prevention, is a field that is a cross-cutting policy field within the EU. And the EU has also supranational decision-making power and instruments, as already mentioned, particularly the instrument contributing to stability and peace, and more broadly to global Europe, as well as enhanced conflict early warning means and mediation support capabilities. Now, given this, I think it's interesting that so far there has been so little discussion, both when we look at research, but also especially the public discussion on how these kind of conflict preventive measures and the role of the EU would contribute as an input towards a more strategically autonomous EU or as an output of that. And so this is what I look at in the paper. And what I find is that even though there has been a lot of institutional development when it comes to this civilian conflict prevention side, actually this kind of pursuit towards especially more geopolitically credible and security-wise credible EU somewhat has led to an overshadowing of these core conflict preventive tools. I record both a decline in the rhetoric adherence to conflict prevention in Council documents, and perhaps more importantly, when I look at the use of the ICSP instrument, we see it being increasingly used for more kind of security and geopolitically oriented objectives than actually kind of core conflict prevention, peace building aims and objectives. And I think big part of this is really because of the ambiguity of the concept of conflict prevention. It has a very broad range and it's kind of difficult to define, and therefore the EU and the member states can put quite a lot of different actions under conflict prevention. And actually the EPF that Tanya mentioned, I think is a really excellent example of this. I agree that it has found a really kind of just and well motivated space now to be used, particularly now the provision to provide lethal support in the case of Ukraine. But at the same time, few would perhaps define it as a conflict preventive action or a conflict preventive tool as such, even though it is often or at times labeled as conflict preventive. Now, again, the key question is, of course, then what does the war mean in general for the EU's positioning as a conflict preventer across the multiple conflicts in the world, and given this pursuit of strategic autonomy. And on the one hand, I see, following what Tanya was also saying, that the war kind of just underlines even more and justifies this turn towards, the EU speaking language of power and using its tools, the ones that it has, including also the conflict preventive tools, to play the geopolitical game and to secure its own interests and the security interests of its member states. But at the same time, we also see that especially the implications of the war, if we look at, for instance, the looming food crisis in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, also in the Middle East, really emphasize the need to not drop the ball when it comes to these often painstakingly long conflict preventive efforts that the EU, again, also has the instruments to actually do and contribute to, but have been increasingly used for this more security and geopolitical interests. So I leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Katarina. Yeah, I think your last comment in particular chimes well with some of the criticism that has been formulated around the entire debate on strategic autonomy, which is, of course, when looking at the EU's policy response in relation to the war in Ukraine, the perceptions in the global south are very different from the ones that we entertain here on the continent. And, perhaps many swathes of the global south are not as impressed with the EU's actions, especially if the Russian narrative feeds into this and is picked up by politicians there too, and then redirected against the European Union for being partly to blame for the food crisis, for example. So I'm sure we'll touch upon these issues still further, but I'm keen to also now shed light on this other major dimension to a debate which is much wider still, of course, than just security, defense, conflict prevention, as well as economic geoeconomics and economic interdependencies, even though there one could label a lot. But it's exactly with that purpose that we'd like to hear from Tobias, how he understands the concept of open strategic autonomy and how it is being applied.
Thank you, Stephen. And I hope I don't sound too robotic. I was told I might have a bit of a robotic sound, so we don't have the digital autonomy chapter with us, but I hope you can hear me. So yeah, allow me to pivot quickly to the economic side of things, where of course we talk about open strategic autonomy a lot. And I have 2 points to make. Quickly go to this chapter, open strategic autonomy. What is it? How is it used? And secondly, if I have time, very quickly, a case where I think open strategic autonomy really bears well in practice, how it is used, especially in the case of critical raw materials. So open strategic autonomy, as already said, the Commission and also DG Trade in particular defines it essentially very broadly. It says it's a mindset, not a strategy. It's just a mindset that says we want to act together with others whenever we can, and we act autonomously whenever we must. And yes, there's criticism to this, that this is a bit, on Monday we cooperate, on Friday we're rivals. But I think this is a pretty fair representation of a complex world. In practice, though, what we've seen in the last 3 to 5 years is really that the autonomous side of open strategic autonomy has really dominated. We've seen a lot of new economic policies implemented in 2017, but especially since 2019, that are labeled autonomous, but they're really unilateral, as opposed to a more bilateral and multilateral approach that EU economic policy was defined by in recent years. Why is that? I think 4 main questions here. Number 1 is really a growing frustration with China and its lacking economic reforms. Secondly, the paralysis of the WTO, which really came to a pit in recent years. Third is certainly also changed political positions in the EU. Some member states have shifted on some of these policies, especially Germany, for example. And fourth, I think most important is really that in Europe, we also see a growing mindset of this geoeconomic competition. That is a logic that we and the great powers are competing over control and access to critical assets, critical technologies, and the supply chains that feed them. And this is a global narrative, a global mindset, but it's certainly rising a lot also within the EU in the last 3 or so years. Now, what have been the objectives of autonomous economic policies in recent years? Again, I think we can have 4 objectives we can identify and group different policies in these objectives. That's what I've done in my chapter, 4 categories, if you will. 1 is policies that are more traditional trade objectives to tackle economic distortions. 2 is policies to defend against economic coercion. 3 is policies to link our economic policy better with environmental and sustainability agenda. And 4th is the more geoeconomic agenda, that is to say, what policies do we need to protect or promote critical assets, critical technologies, and their supply chain. Now, I don't go into detail here. I try to list sort of the existing policies and the policy debates in these categories, just to help us a bit better understand where action is taking place. And I have 3 main observations from this chapter. Number 1 is, I think the EU has been really quite comprehensive in putting our policies in these 4 categories. But comprehensive does not mean necessarily deep. So on the one hand, many of these policies are still under negotiation, so we do not yet know exactly what the outcome will be. There's just an intent. And some policies which have been implemented, especially, for example, investment screening, export controls, are really rather the lowest common denominator. Number two observation is that there are more objectives now at play. So it's not only about prosperity and openness, but there are security and sustainability objectives at play. I am not under the impression that they are mutually exclusive. However, there are clear trade-offs. That is obvious, I think. And what open strategic autonomy ideally would do is to have a better debate of where these trade-offs lie and what unions or the member states' priorities are. And too often, I think it's a bit of having our cake and also eating it. There has to be a bit more of a debate. Where are the trade-offs? Number three observation is that so there have been many policies, many regulatory innovations at the EU level, but there's an open question whether this is a bit of a technocratic fix to what is essentially very much a geopolitical question, right? The relationship between the United States and China, as was mentioned, and especially our role within it. So the question is, can a technocratic fix really, is it really the adequate response to what's happening in the world? So that's what I wanted to quickly talk about my chapter in the special edition. Very briefly, allow me to make two minutes about where I think this really comes down to in our current debate. Because the Russian war and the energy crisis puts again as a last example of vulnerabilities and strategic dependencies the EU has on rivals. And there's, I think, really a very broad agreement right now across the EU that one key objective of the European strategic autonomy is to decrease these strategic dependencies. And since they have been shown again and again, the vulnerabilities that we suffer. And one case where this is, I think, really playing out quite positively, and that's why I want to highlight is this debate about critical raw materials. Now, many of you already know that this is where the European Union has lots of dependencies, especially in one field, for example, rare earth materials, where most of you know that China dominates the whole value chain. And I really mean the whole value chain. It's not only about mining, but it's about mining, then separating, then refining, and then using these inputs into input technologies like permanent magnets. And these permanent magnets go into wind turbines, electric vehicles, and so on. So it's important because China dominates not only the mining aspect, but really key aspects of this whole value chain. And the question is, how do we decrease this dependency? It's not so easy because you cannot just diversify it away. China is really a key leader in many of these technologies and has a sort of a chokehold on some of these segments of the value chain. And there is no approach where it says we have to just be more open or have more free trade agreements to break these choke points. I think the task has to be, what is our objective? We want to break these vulnerabilities, these choke points. And both openness and autonomy policies come into play. So, for example, the European Commission and the EU has been developing critical raw materials action plans and strategies for some years, but they've really done more and more in the past, which really highlight this sort of double-edged sword. On the one hand, having international partnerships, going out to resource-rich countries, helping them finance mining projects, for example, helping them develop through finance and aid separation and other infrastructure, binding them into an emerging value chain. But then also the international aspect, cooperating with Japan and the United States, for example, in the Trade and Technology Council, there's a big item that is tasked to say, how can we cooperate together on this vulnerability that the Americans, the Japanese, and the Europeans have. But then there's also this autonomous side to it that's quite strong, and it's the question: how can we, what kind of domestic capacities can we increase? For example, does that mean we need mining projects? What kind of financial and regulatory questions do potential mines in Europe bring? What kind of recycling capabilities can we increase? What kind of research funds, for example, do we need to perhaps substitute some of these materials? So, and I think, again, it's a great example because it really brings together. It's not about we are open or we are autonomous, right? It's just there's an issue we have a chokehold in some of these things. So any policy, making these policies work together is really the key idea here. That's one example of a supply vulnerability, but of course there's other cases where there's very different demands, and this equation of openness and autonomy is not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? It really has to be adapted to each question, and it's applied in one way for critical raw materials, but it's applied in quite a different way, for example, in the question of semiconductor vulnerability. But just to conclude here, I think open strategic autonomy really comes to play already in practice. It's very much in policies, and it will stay with us for sure as we're integrating different trade, industrial policy, foreign policy, and so on in bigger strategies. Thank you.
Thanks, Tobias, for pointing to the contradiction in terms, or perhaps it ain't. Yes, Tanya, we know you have to leave, no problem. Good luck with your next commitment, and thanks for joining us here. Tobias, thanks for pointing to the apparent contradiction in terms, which it's not. I mean, in fact, there's nevertheless an inherent tension, of course, that energizes the concept of strategic autonomy. And I think the example that you gave about access to critical raw materials is a good one to establish the trade-offs, indeed, that need to be taken. But you mentioned in your overview of different tools that the EU is now developing, a significant unilateralist approach to at least the design of new defensive, potentially also offensive trade instruments. And I wonder if the EU is then not setting itself up for policy failure in a way, because it is, at least when compared to the other big trading blocs in the world, the most open of them, the most reliant, in fact, on open trade. China, with its dual circulation strategy, and the US being a continent on its own, being more resilient to global shocks, whereas the EU is more vulnerable to it. So, are these tools that the EU is developing, these and of this unilateralist streak, not perhaps counterproductive in the end? And using them might invite indeed counteraction, which the EU is not looking for.
Yeah, indeed. So the timeline that I looked at in this chapter, really until 2021, I agree. It was really autonomous, or let's say, as it's the truth, it was very unilateral, especially in trade policy, but also, of course, if you count other economic instruments like industrial policy tools, which are not defensive. I think they're promoting, of course, domestic action, but they're still quite unilateral. Now, there was quite a streak, I think, for 3 years, and the pendulum was really swinging towards a more unilateral union. However, having said this, I still think that that it's not quite clear. The future might look quite different. I think there's also serious and very important open actions or cooperative actions in the realm now that I didn't talk about in the chapter so much because for reasons, but there's a Trade and Technology Council, which is quite significant, I think, because it takes a lot of these unilateral agonies that the European Union has on defending itself and protecting itself and bringing it into an international environment. There's similar discussions on these with Japan and others. There's ideas to broaden the framework of the Trade and Technology Council to others. That's one. And number two is also another foreign policy agenda, which so far has not received much attention. But I believe it might really come to the fore maybe this year or next year, is the Global Gateway Strategy, which is really the flip side of the EU's geoeconomic agenda. That is not only defending its own market, but building infrastructure and value chains abroad, including our partners in the neighborhood or in Africa, into these emerging value chains, be it hydrogen or batteries. And that requires investment, that requires aid, and that requires a political strategy to go outside. I think it's coming and developing, and I think we might see the pendulum swing back a bit. And I also add to this the last point that I think much of it had, or some of it, to be fair, was influenced also by the French presidency, as I might say. They had a very strong push, I think, on some of these instruments, which will come to fruition, I think, eventually. But the next presidencies, the Czech Republic and Sweden, have already indicated they are intending to have a more outward-looking position again on international trade issues and international economic issues. And I think we will see more of a balance in the future on this question: what do we do at home autonomously, and what do we do with partners at the same time?
Thanks, Tobias. And in a way, we've already started the Q&A. I would very much like to appeal to our online audience to formulate any questions or observations that you may have in the Q&A function of the Zoom. I know that there's quite a bit of firepower around the virtual table there, so we would welcome your interventions. But if you don't, I will just ramble on, of course. And a linkage which I see first with the topic that Katarina suggested, is of course in this global gateway initiative, 300 billion plan basically of the European Union to try and raise in public-private partnerships enough funds in order to sustainably invest into like-minded countries in particular, which could of course help to address some of the root causes that you've been pointing at, Katarina. Do you think, is from your perspective, is there promise in this debate or not?
Thanks. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I guess we shall see. But I think theoretically, or the expectation would be that it has the potential, of course, to contribute to particularly this sort of structural conflict prevention, by which we mean indeed, even in context societies where you don't have acute threats of escalation, like-minded states, partners, to address vulnerabilities to potential conflict escalation, and at the same time to enhance kind of the sources of resilience, sources of cohesion, which theoretically, I think indeed this global gateway could contribute to. But I think it boils down to indeed on what premises and really for what objectives those funds are allocated. And I think one key word here is conflict sensitivity, from the EU's perspective, and indeed from the perspective of whether and how they contribute to more structural conflict prevention. And I think here one key instrument, again, that the EU has, or actually that's not an instrument itself, but a condition within one of the instruments of the broad tool set that we are talking about, is this new commitment that the EU made with the Global Europe, the NDC, in all conflict affected and fragile societies to conduct this conflict analysis before actually engaging in I would say first and foremost development cooperation, but I guess when and if these 300 billions also touch upon such contexts in those cases as well, or when it comes to those countries as well. And I think these sort of steps are really important to make sure that any financial cooperation, support, trade actually contributes also to conflict prevention and doesn't, for instance, backlash and actually have counterproductive and opposite effects, which they also can have. So yeah, I would emphasize conflict sensitivity, and that's of course again it's a difficult concept and another ambiguous concept, but it's definitely needed, and perhaps something that at least I haven't really seen a lot when this global gateway is discussed.
Yeah, perhaps it's too early for that, of course. I saw also that some people from the EES's Directorate on International Peace and Security were also on the call, so perhaps they might want to come in on those issues. But I think the proof of the pudding, of course, Katarina, will be where the EU puts its money eventually, and how it frames it, whether it takes conflict sensitivity on board in the framing of that debate. But also, you know, it is reliant, of course, on the type of information that it might be able to glean from its EU delegations on in the field, its partners, and is in that sense also reliant, of course, on local partnerships, grassroots level partnerships, in order to be able to tick off two boxes at the same time: root cause, conflict prevention, as well as the development of greener economic partnerships that strengthen its geopolitical position. But Niklas, there's a lot of emphasis, of course, on partnerships in the development of this concept of strategic autonomy. Yet there's also a keen realization as a result of the war in Ukraine that the EU will have to deal with non-like-minded states around the world if it wants to maintain, for example, you know, those elements of the rules-based international order, structures and institutions that from which it has benefited for so long. Do you find in the debates around strategic autonomy that there's been enough attention being paid as to which non-like-minded states or actors the EU would have to do business with, and what type of trade-offs that might entail?
Yeah, thank you for this question, because this gives me really a chance to open up a little bit more on other aspects of the strategic autonomy debate, because we have been focusing now, rightly so, on the defense aspects, and we have focused on the economic aspects. But I think a major part of strategic autonomy is also the diplomacy of the EU and the diplomacy of EU member states. And I think this is really where the secondary effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine kick in. I think Tanya was excellent in pointing out the kind of immediate reaction of the EU in terms of being creative, of using military funds to have a quick reaction and a necessary reaction to the crisis. And I think that there were really the highlights of the EU performance, and Tanya highlighted those really well. But she's also was right, and now she's not in the room anymore. I would like to discuss with her further, but you know, she pointed out it's like a 3-month anniversary, and I think the question is rather also in the long game, and what are the secondary effects that we are going to seeing down the road. And what I would highlight there is what is the EU's position going to be in the multilateral order? Right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the EU was very successful in the UN General Assembly to get those like-minded countries together that you refer to, and to get like an overwhelming majority to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But already there we could see that even though only, I had the numbers here somewhere, even though there were only 35 countries that abstained, and even less that voted against this resolution, they represented a majority of the world's population. So this is really like a development that we as Europeans have to be worried that the global South and others don't necessarily look at the conflict, as we mentioned earlier, and at the developments in the same way, and that we are risking to lose partners. It was even more striking when it came to the exclusion of Russia from the Human Rights Council, because there we had in total 58 countries that abstained. And that included many of those countries that we actually tried to get close on our side when it came to global action, and were part of this alliance of multilateralism. So they included South Africa, they included India, those countries. So I think there is really the task also of the EU diplomacy and diplomacy of member states in the long run to engage those partners more effectively. But I mean, those votes were won, and as I heard from people close to the processes at the United Nations, the EU was very instrumental in getting those votes for these two resolutions, and was very effective in lobbying for those votes, together with the delegations in the countries themselves, in close coordination with the United States. They put to effect all the manpower that the EU and the EU member states have at the UN to get this going, and I think this can also be a positive example. But the trends structurally are playing against the EU, and it has to stay engaged, I think, also on the side of diplomacy. And I think this is very, very much part of the strategic autonomy debate. As I said earlier, it's not only about protectionism, it's not only about also like sustaining our own competitiveness and industries and these things, but it's also about the projection of our values globally and to make this work via diplomacy.
Yeah, it ties in directly to a question which Mr. Van Iersel has typed into the Q&A function. Thank you very much for that first question. We look forward to others too. And it's something, Niklas, that I wanted to throw back at you, and then also ask Tobias for his economic view on the same question, because if we think in political terms, at least, of dealing with non-like-minded states, the obvious example now is, of course, Russia. And if Russia proposes a ceasefire agreement over Ukraine, do we accept it? Do we accept negotiation with a war criminal, just as with Stalin after the Second World War, some would point out? Or do we reject that outright to protect whatever values that we stand for in defense of Ukrainian sovereignty as well? It points to ultimately a debate which is being held within the EU itself, and the divisions which may occur between member states in their understanding of the concept of strategic autonomy, both in a political sense as well as in economic sense, protectionism or not. And so the question here is, in some member states, the attitude may change also as a consequence of national elections. Looking at France today, Italy next year, for instance. And the question is there really a shared concrete feeling or narrative as a basis to common positions? Niklas first, and then Tobias.
Yeah, thank you. This is an excellent question, and it really, I think, puts the finger to one of the problems behind the strategic autonomy debate, that there is not really a completely shared and joint narrative, but then that, I explain in my contribution to the special issue, actually, but without now making too much advertisement to that on that. But that is actually why the term strategic autonomy has risen to so much prominence, right? Because it can be used by different actors, different interest organizations, different political orientations, as a blank canvas to project their own ideas on that, what the EU is supposed to do. And that is why, you know, there is no kind of common understanding what is behind it. So, for example, it is used a lot, of course, in this kind of security and military purpose, in the sense that when it comes to security, it has to be more about hard security. It has to be more focused on geopolitical competition and our military capabilities. So this is used a lot in especially by proponents of bigger defense expenditure and a bigger role of the European Union also in defense issues. But one can, of course, also see how this might be used for other political purposes as well. Like if there's a very left-leaning government in a major European country, one can they can use this concept or exploit this concept even to point towards economic protectionism and the need to be more protectionist when it comes to trade policy, to protect basically also not only European industries but also European labor and European jobs. So the short answer is there's no joint narrative behind this strategic autonomy debate, but it really it is like became an umbrella term to kind of discuss different visions of the European Union, whether there's an peace actor, whether there's a market actor, whether there's a security actor, and to forward ideas. So this doesn't necessarily give too much hope that it will be a very constructive concept always, strategic autonomy looking forward, but it can be also quite divisive between member states because they have different ideas and they cannot agree on a common cause.
Tobias, is there more cohesion on trade, even if economic realities, of course, might split member states?
Yeah, it's a complicated picture. I agree with Niklas. It's a narrative. I agree, and each narrative has coalitions and actors who adhere to this narrative. But then you can interpret it very differently. Strategic autonomy narrative interlinks with different other narratives, including a more mercantilist, protectionist narrative in the economic field, but also with one about global threats from climate change, from international rivals, and so on. So there's this coalition building between these narratives. And overall, I think strategic autonomy, especially open strategic autonomy, has been used quite well by the Commission in particular to build these coalitions of different actors, to bridge a bit in the classical trade sense as the protectionist with the free traders. But open strategic autonomy, I think, really tries to be a bit more bridge builder, and the way the Commission has used it, DG Trade in particular, I think has been quite successful in the last years to say, well, it's all kind of part of our narrative, right? You can interpret it a bit like this, interpret it a little bit like that, and has in effect, I think, built more support for its agenda. So in that sense, yes, there will never be a single narrative on open strategic autonomy, but that doesn't mean I think it can't be a tool to build better coalitions, stronger coalitions, to bring in the environmental debate, to bring in the protectionist debate, to bring in the free trade debate, and try to bring it together to build a support for an agenda.
Then that still raises the question, which I wanted to put to all three of you. And the word Zeitenwende was used. I'm not particularly fond of introducing new German terms that are supposedly unique, but for which perfect English translations exist, such as paradigm shift. The war in Ukraine has nevertheless been interpreted by some as a transformational moment in the EU's policy response, in bolstering, one would assume, therefore also its strategic autonomy. Do you see that really having, or do you see any empirical evidence in these first 4 months since Russia invaded Ukraine, of such an emerging strategic autonomy in the fields that you have covered? And perhaps, Katarina, you would like to go first.
Thanks. Yeah, that's an excellent question. But again, I think we are yet too early on, unfortunately, in what looks like a long war to judge that. But I think I would again emphasize perhaps more the continuities and the fact that the trends that we see, especially in security and defense and conflict prevention and kind of the EU's responses to conflicts and crises, I see those have already taken place prior to what we see now in the EU's response to Ukraine, or at least the kind of abilities, institutions that have enabled the EU to take certain steps have actually already been adopted before. And why they have been adopted before is precisely this kind of perhaps more gradual paradigm shift when it comes to why and how the EU responses to conflicts and crises. And what I argue in the paper is that basically, even though this pursuit of military capabilities, as Niklas introduced, has been there from the beginning of early 2000s at least, what we see now is that what has changed is the strategic environment of the EU, of course. And what I think has happened with that is that these more hard security and defense capabilities today are being pursued not to do conflict prevention and kind of crisis management externally, to spread our norms and kind of build peace externally more effectively, but really more saliently to basically secure Europe itself, right? Because we feel more threatened. And with that, I mean, we've seen steps such as the EPF, for instance, that I think responds to this. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the EPF, for instance, again, was there already to be used before the war started. And because it was there, it was also the EU and the member states were able to draw on this tool. Now, what I think is really interesting to think about, for instance, specifically when it comes to the EPF, and indeed this provision to provide lethal support, is whether and how the fact that it's now being used for the first time in Ukraine, in this context that I would argue not many saw it to be used when it was first initiated and adopted in 21, or first initiated in 2017 and then adopted in 21. But now that it is being used in this context, which again is very kind of commonly seen as being very justified context to use it, I think it's interesting to see whether that sets what type of threshold and kind of example for its later use. And I think that will kind of show to what extent this sort of, or what type of paradigm shift is happening when it comes to the EU's responses to conflicts and crises. And it might be that actually it sets quite a high threshold to situations in which the EU actually provides lethal support to a conflict party. I mean, this context is very different than, the kind of nowadays more standard context of the EU's conflict responses, which are more that of countries' internal conflicts, very complex situations like the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and others, in which context this instrument was also quite heavily criticized when it was adopted, precisely because there were fears that it might actually contribute to conflict escalatory processes rather than preventive processes. So I think it's going to be interesting to see whether and how this crisis actually could bring some clarity in terms of how the EU uses its wide tool set when it comes to conflicts and crises.
Thanks, Katarina. Yes, if applied at scale, there might be and Zeitenwende, if you want, a paradigm shift. But so far, you see an acceleration primarily. I mean, some innovation, of course, with lethal aid being provided, setting up the threshold quite high for future repetition. Niklas.
Yeah, so as Katarina already pointed out, I think what might be the worrying aspect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that we might see a rather long war potentially, and at the same time, I think that this Zeitenwende, historical juncture, this historic change, is also only at the beginning, you know. So I think, for example, in the context of Germany, the first steps of giving the speech that Olaf Scholz did and announcing the change in the military budget, this extra funding of the military budget of Germany, they were big historic changes. But to implement those and to really have a larger strategic change of a country's foreign and security policy takes a much longer time. These were like trigger moments. This was like the start, but there are bigger challenges to that, because strategic cultures of countries don't easily change overnight. And we can already see now in the discussion around Germany and its implementation of everything around this historical juncture, that it takes some time naturally until a strategic culture of a country adjusts and realizes that it's now in a competitive scenario with a competitor or with an enemy on the same continent. And yeah, that takes larger changes in the popular perception. That takes a long time in the party structures to go through. It needs a generational change maybe as well to slowly sink in. And it leads, and then probably Tobias can speak more to that. It also needs large-scale adjustments when it comes to economic makeup of a country. And this is not only the case for Germany, I would say, even though I took this as an example, but I would apply this to the EU and also to the EU institutions and the European Commission as well. We have this talk now already for a couple of years of a geopolitical commission, but being an actor within a competitive landscape, either worldwide when it comes to great power competition or when it comes to standing up to Russian aggression, that is not in the DNA of the European Commission. That is not what the European Commission was made of. Take, for example, the economic aspects that Tobias perfectly lined out. I mean, the Commission is built around and the mindset of the Commission is mainly built around the mindset of liberal economic trade relationship in the world, around the mindset of openness. And now this is changing, and now they need to be more strategic in their action. So this also needs a cultural shift, I would assume, in Brussels institutions. So yes, we are at this moment of historical juncture, but it's only the start of a longer process, and to sustain it will need more changes in the fabric and in the minds and in the strategic cultures of everyone involved.
Yeah, Tobias?
I would just add that yes, I mean, there's a political big picture shift that talked about, and that's a question of narrative, of paradigm. But more on the technical aspects of things, I think there will really be significant changes. I think this, Russian war in Ukraine and the sanctions campaign and the lack of resources, the continued fracturing of supply chain, it really drives home a point that's been growing for the last 2 years, that there has to be a shift in how governments approach and look at their economic links, their technological links, their financial links. And it's become quite evident also again with the sanction campaign. I think there are, first of all, the European Union has to understand what kind of impact its sanctions can have on Russia, which requires a lot of intelligence and data into how these two economies are linked. At the same time, these cascading effects across the global economy, which are of course fueled by the sanctions, right? These were perhaps poorly understood, or it's consequences that are difficult to contain. But there's a lot of knowledge demand, intelligence demand on understanding how the European economy and how it is linked into these global processes. And so we can already witness this today, I think, that at the Commission level especially, but also at the member states level, there's more demand for building structures of how do we get the flashlight and look into these supply chains, into these production chains that governments have very little understanding about in the past. And there's huge demand now growing. And that's a bit maybe of a technocratic shift. So the question comes back, of course, does this kind of shift not also need a strategic guideline of where we actually want to go with any of this? But in a way, perhaps they're running parallel. I think at this technical level, there's huge changes in foreign ministries and economic ministries of what they want to know and in their foreign economic relations. So yes, in a sense, I think that's something to look out for. How it's sort of a boring kind of think tank observation maybe, but how these government structures will change in the future. As I said, the different governments, different member states approaching this very differently, setting up new working groups, setting up new task forces in the ministries, in the government offices, really tasked to try to understand these interlinkages, how we're vulnerable, but also where we're strong and where we want to retain strength. And that's I think really going to be a significant change and process in the next 5 years.
Yeah, which might, and this contradicts perhaps the point that Niklas was making, which gives more room, in fact, for a geopolitical commission as geoeconomics become the new geopolitics, if you want, irrespective of the anachronistic war that Ukraine is suffering from on the hands of Russia. I'll give Niklas a chance to respond to that. I would just add one additional thought, of course, is that in a whole debate about EU enlargement with the membership applications of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, the European Commission itself had to think geopolitically for the European Union, had to test, of course, the political waters in member states as to issue realistic opinions, and at the same time reflect on, well, quite existential matters about the future shape of the European Union, power distribution, money distribution in the future of the European Union when we take on these new members, and of course relations with problematic neighbors such as Russia. So perhaps there is something to be said for a geopolitical commission after all, Niklas. And you'll have the final word.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to downplay this steps that the Commission has done and the work that is being done in the Commission, and we have seen some extraordinary changes, and they were highlighted today. My point maybe would be that we are still in the moment of crisis handling, and that many of these aspects going to stick for us for a long time. And you mentioned the enlargement question. Obviously, there is still the big question out. Okay, yes, saying maybe now in the coming days yes to the membership aspiration of Ukraine is a good step to take in this moment, and shows like the Commission's ability to answer these calls for more geopolitical action. But this will be also a challenge in the years to come when there will be frustrations probably in the membership process. So the question of the end game after the war maybe is out of the hot phase. Where does it leave the relations with Russia in the future? Where does it leave the EU enlargement policy? Where does it leave EU's trade policy, but also EU's actions and other fields of security, for example, conflict prevention? I think there we are only at the beginning, or can be only at the beginning of a larger debate on the EU as a global actor. And now to kind of round this thing up, I would say that, you know, we tried with this, around this concept of strategic autonomy, to provide a lens on this debate that is happening, and that will be happening also in the years to come. And I hope, you know, we can continue this conversation amongst those here in the virtual room, but also with you know, with interested audiences and the community EU foreign policy family at large. So I thought this was a very interesting seminar, and yeah, let's keep on discussing these topics, and we here in Finland will be continuing to work on these topics also in the future. Not only because we have also big task here to think ahead about our security as we are applying for NATO membership, something that we didn't have the chance to discuss today, but this will also, of course, raise some question when it comes to the division of labor between EU and NATO, which haven't been so far completely thought through here in Helsinki, I believe, either. So lots to think about.
Thanks very much, Niklas, Katerina, Tobias, and of course also Tanya, who had to leave early, for elucidating the concept, your views on the evolution, the design, the ambiguities, and the implementation of the different dimensions of the concept. We would like to thank you for of course sharing your wisdom and insights with our audience, not just in the virtual room, but I understand also in the conference room at CEPS, where some people did end up participating in this event. So thank you very much for still finding your way to our premises. Next time you will be greeted with a glass and some food, no doubt. But indeed, as Niklas mentioned, we will have to revisit this debate. For all interested in the contributions, the articles are online, freely downloadable until the end of this month on the website, which we've shared earlier, and which will be twittering around still for the next few days. To all of you, thank you very much for joining today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Bye-bye.